The main focus today is looking at gender mainstreaming in your workplace. I'm here as a technical advisor working in gender mainstreaming. I'll be here until September 9th, so for 1 month in Mongolia. My background is in gender. I studied international development in my undergrad, and then I did an MBA in sustainability. And I've done 2 certificates, one in gender development and one focusing on gender-based violence. A lot of my initial experience was in Africa. I worked in 3 different countries there. Recently, I've focused on Asia, so I've worked in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and now Mongolia. I also worked in the Arctic in Canada in the north, focusing on negotiations and policy up there. So I just want to go over some goals and objectives for today so that we can mutually agree upon what we want to get out of this. So just some basics from this training. I'm hoping that you'll have a better understanding of gender mainstreaming opportunities within your workplace itself. And I'd love to see this filter into more of your organizational practices and your programming as well. And the end goal, with the help of your gender focal person, would be to create a gender mainstreaming policy in the future. So I know for a lot of you this is very new, so try not to be intimidated. There's a lot of new terms, but it's very interesting to know and to learn about these behaviors that we've grown up with, and to understand some of the differences and the reason why certain gender equalities exist. The first thing is, why gender? Why are we looking at gender, talking about gender issues today? So I think one of the most common things I have come up in a lot of my trainings is that gender is just a woman's issue. Why do men have to care? Why do organizations have to care? And I think it's important to realize that gender equality is good for everyone, and it's good for your organization. There's done a lot of studies, and statistics have proven that gender equality helps with growth economically throughout the country and also within your organization. We've seen this a lot in the West, and I think it's something that is really important here as well. Aside from increased productivity, I think in this day and age, especially with the employees you want to attract, it is very important to have fair and equal rights at the workplace. I think this also makes you stand out as an organization as far as international donors and businesses, especially when you're competing for these funds. And it helps overall organizational performance as well. I want to just jump into understanding gender roles. So for a lot of you, this might be a new concept, but there's a big difference between gender and sex. So sex is more biological, whereas gender is something that's socially constructed. And these social influences affect the opportunities that are between men and women and our relationships with each other. I just want to show you a chart that kind of sums it up. So this is sex, and then this is gender. So sex is, as mentioned, biologically determined. It is universal for all human beings and unchanging. And gender is constructed by society, multifaceted, so it differs between cultures and geography. So gender norms that exist in Canada would be entirely different in some senses than what exists in Mongolia. And one of the most important aspects of gender is that it's fluid and changes over time, called gender biases. These are learned behaviors from when we're young that make us associate one thing with men and maybe one thing with women that don't have, they're not biologically determined. So society and media plays a big role in this, even from the time that we are little babies. I can give an example from back home. I don't know if it's similar here, but boys are often dressed in blue and girls are dressed in pink. And you will see this a lot in the media. The media plays a big role in looking at gender biases. So this is a really important point, because most of the inequalities that you will see in a workplace are not based on biological. They're based on gender social norms and learned behaviors. And it's important to know that these have the ability to change. And we have the potential to have more equal opportunities for both men and women in a workplace. Now, next we will get into gender issues within Mongolia. But I think an important thing is to think about your grandparents. Think of your grandmother, for instance, and what her reality was as a woman. And now think of your circumstance. I think this shows how things have changed, and that it is a constantly changing scale. And obviously you can see there are pictures of women maybe in societally perceived non-traditional roles. So I'm looking at Mongolia and gender and things that have come up. It was interesting researching this, because there is quite a lot of women that have high levels of education here. And in some sectors, in cases, there were more women educated than men. And now when you see these statistics, then people say, well, what are we doing here? Why are we looking at gender inequality if more women are educated than men? And I think the important point is, where are these women working and what fields? So when you look at the data, a large share of women participate in unpaid family work, especially in rural areas. And this makes sense based on the agrarian culture. This is very common. But there is concern about the urban-rural divide and the challenges Mongolia faces in relation to urbanization and migration, and how that provides equal opportunities or not so equal opportunities. And this is an important point, as socioeconomic status factors a lot into gender inequality. And as we mentioned, a lot of social stereotypes that are consumed by social norms and perceived ideas about gender are the reason for these divides and inequalities. Particularly with women being the caregiver and staying at home, and perceived pressures has a very limiting factor for them to participate in the workforce, even when they are educated. So I also wanted to look at Mongolia gender issues in the mining industry. There's a lot of high levels of occupational segregation in high growth sectors such as mining, but also other sectors as well. And this was mainly dating back to regulations, I guess, that had existed until 2008, where women were prohibited engaging in a broad list of activities, such as heavy equipment. And this is a clear example of how gender normative behavior can influence women and men's equality in the workplace. And some other facts: approximately 1,000 organizations registered with AITI Mongolia. In 2014, they estimate only 10% of the employees were women. I think it's also important to note that there were large wage gaps as well. For instance, women were paid 23% less than men in mining and 17% less in transport on average. While these were male-dominated sectors, this was not as surprising to me, but what was surprising was that women were paid nearly a third less in the community and social services, where their participation is actually quite high. Wage inequality is a big issue globally. This is something that we are working on still in Canada and are nowhere near. So I think it's also important to look at where women were working within the mining sector as well. Not uncommon, women were mostly in the informal sector of wage employment, in service sector, and support positions, retail, catering. There are many reasons for this, but it's very common that women work in the informal sectors due to a need for flexibility as often they are the primary caregivers for children at home. To the second point, this was really interesting, that many women in a number of organizations documented sexual harassment and a lack of gender sensitivity and training within the organizations themselves. And there was a lack of flexibility with many of the organizations with living and working practices. We have a very good example of the things that are being done within a mining company in Mongolia. This was brought to our attention as, he used to work there, and there was a lot of interesting policies they were working on. I think one of the things that stuck out about this example, as there are many we could use internationally, but this is not only a local example, but was the enthusiasm the employees had for these policies, as a clear example. And that, I think, is the goal. You want employees to be invested in these policies and in these programs as well. In Canada, it's a common practice that both federal and provincial and territorial governments have practices very similar to this. Aside from gender equality practices, which mainly are in the form of what we call affirmative action, it is very standard at every workplace, both public and private, to have anti-harassment or sexual harassment policies readily available for everyone to read. Trainings are common when you start. It is mandatory, and you are told the person that is in charge of complaints, so you know the process if something occurs. So yes, government departments in Canada are seen as the model more for fairness and equality over the private sector. It also is illegal to be fired for lodging a harassment complaint against anyone in your organization. So maybe that gives you some ideas. These are also common with large international NGOs, the UN. All of these would be common practices within their organizations. So hopefully you see some ways that these ideas can transfer into your organization as well. Only you can be the global agents for change within your own organization. So you've talked a lot about gaps, but I think there's a lot of positive points Mongolia has going for it. Particularly the levels of education, particularly among women. But it is important to point out that gender is for men and women. Gender issues exist on both sides. So with a reverse gender gap, as we call it, with men staying at home and women being educated, this is not good either. We want to see equal education levels between both. And I should point out the reason we focus so much on women is often they are the more marginalized group, but gender equality, yes, is for both men and women. Yes, and when we talk about how gender is changing constantly, and we talk about positive aspects in Mongolia, I think if we look at how Mongolia actually has a documented policy on parental leave, whereas the US doesn't even have this. They have 4 weeks, it's optional, and it's only for women. Each country tends to be different. Mm-hmm. The most progressive examples I have seen tend to be in Scandinavia. Mm-hmm. Yes. Particularly, I hear a lot of examples in Sweden, where they give extra money for single-parent households. They have, I believe it's up to 2 years, and they give good funding per month while they are away from the workplace. They also subsidize childcare when you return to the office, which is a very big thing because many women can't afford to go back to work if they are the caregiver, especially in single-parent households, when childcare costs are very high for daycare and things like that. Yeah. When I was in Sri Lanka, there was some good examples, particularly with Care International. a colleague that worked there, they had childcare available in the office. So these are actually examples that people can do anywhere in the world. It's important to understand that it's a long process, but the first step is gender awareness training. From my perspective, policies are very important, as you can go back to them, and they, in many cases, are legally binding. But we also have to have executive buy-in. Having a gender focal point and gender committees are with stakeholders from all different departments of the organization is also very important. But most importantly, also identifying the gender needs of your organization. For instance, we could create a gender policy for you right now, but without all these other factors, maybe it just sits on a shelf. But as you will see, we'll give tips later on that will help establish towards gender policies, but also things like gender checklists, so you can integrate gender at every step of your project. I just want to bring up an example. One of the best examples I saw was through Unilever in their work in Sri Lanka. So they have different branches. And I was very impressed with what they're doing. So I said, do you have gender committees and a gender department? And he said, no. And I said, well, how do you do this? And he says, because we have moved past gender committees, that it's integrated into every section of our organization. So everybody was invested in wanting to have gender equality. To me, that is the goal, to have every person at every level in your organization, man or woman, be a champion for gender equality in every project you do. As mentioned, though, this is a long process, and that is why we are here to support. How we think about women's roles at home and men's roles as well entirely affects how we look at those roles in the workplace. I will give you some clear examples of how this transfers. For instance, something as simple as parental leave, which can be taken by men and women. So these are perceived social normative behaviors. When a woman takes the leave, her progression at work is not equal to a man at a similar level. Because in the time that she is gone, even though she is guaranteed to come back at the equal position, the man at the same level has had opportunities for networking and advancement. And even when women are working, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, whether they have children or not, they are expected to be home and cook for the family at a certain hour. And if children need to be picked up from school or daycare, it is statistically the woman who usually has to leave early from work to do this. This is an example of how societal roles at home and in the personal life affects the working relationship for women and men in the office. And as we are progressing, there is more equality between roles, especially with younger generations who are becoming more educated on gender awareness. But it's important that workplaces are also very flexible in supporting that. So this is something that exists around the world. I saw a very interesting example from Sheryl Sandberg. She's the CEO for Facebook. And in their company in the States, it's not very progressive, but they're pushing for these things. So they offer 4 months for men or women, but they particularly target for the men to take the leave because societally men feel men are not always encouraged. As we can see, all gender mainstreaming means is basically looking that attention is given to gender perspectives as an integral part of all activities, programs, policies, right down to your budgeting within an organization. Yeah, so this looks at mainly looking at how we integrate it into all of our decision-making processes. That's a very important aspect of it. And gender mainstreaming is looking at gender perspectives, meaning not just more opportunities for women. That is a goal because of the marginalization of women, but looking at equal opportunities between men and women. Yes, and I think one of the biggest parts for this is making sure it's just at every single level where people focus on gender priorities, they often forget the financial and the implementation side of it. So this is just a good kind of, picture example on how gender mainstreaming exists. So gender perspectives should go into every single state. When you talk about where to start with gender mainstreaming policies, this kind of gives a good indicator for the steps. We will go into detail, but you can see this would be the beginning, the analysis of your organization to see what's working well, what's not, and what the... Often what we assume are our needs are not our needs. So it's important to do this analysis to see where the gaps are. And that will feed into the rest of your planning process, which we will go into more detail, but I just thought this was a good answer. Okay. I think the most important aspect is to make sure that your programs, policies are not gender blind. I have seen very high level projects that have been gender blind. So the next thing we want to go into is gender empowerment. So gender empowerment, we're mainly focusing on women again because they are statistically the more marginalized group. Empowerment looks at women gaining power and control over their own lives. So this next part is really important. It involves awareness raising, building self-confidence, expansion of choices, increase access to and control over resources, and probably the most important part, actions to transform the structures and institutions which reinforce and perpetuate gender stereotyping or discrimination. This is a really important definition, not just because of the obvious equality benefits, but because women and men, the way they're raised, they're socialized, they're very different, which transfers to the workplace. And this is an important point because the way that women are socialized to perform in a workplace, often they are taught to be more passive and less assertive than the way men are socialized. So raising this awareness and building this self-confidence is very important in the workplace environment. And when we look at things like pay inequalities, some of these are just blatant discrimination, but some of them are based on social learned behaviors. And this explains a lot of not only the pay inequalities, but the hierarchy inequalities. Why many companies don't have a lot of women managers, because men are more assertive when going for high-level roles than women traditionally. So the next very important topic is based on gender equality. Okay, so this one is very important, everyone understands. It refers to the equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities, that's very key, of women and men. In this definition, they use also girls and boys, but women and men is what we'll discuss. So this implies that the priorities of both women and men are taken into consideration, recognizing the diversity of the two groups, and that they have different backgrounds that have brought them to what that level is that they're at. So this last point is something we've talked about and we need to keep emphasizing. Gender equality is not a woman's issue. It's not just a woman's issue. It's an issue that should concern men and women equally. It is a human rights issue, and we should all be concerned. And when we talk about gender equality, we're looking at engaging men and women equally. But as mentioned, since our current societal norms are very patriarchal, a lot of the emphasis on programming and inclusion focuses on women. But the end goal is to not target one gender over the other, one sex over the other. It's to look equally at rights for each person in the workplace, irregardless. Just one more point I want to make on gender equality. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear is that men and women are equal, but we look at programming without looking at the differences that men and women have in their background to get there. So we don't accommodate those needs. And that's very important. So yes, in your programming, to target men and women equally without having an understanding of social norms and backgrounds and how that might affect them differently can allow for gender bias and gender blind programs. All right, so opportunities for gender mainstreaming. Hopefully this will be a practical understanding of ways that you can integrate what we've been talking about today into your own workplace. Some very basic programs that have started to be implemented in many workplaces include women in management, mentorship programs, equal wages, flexible schedules. Yeah, so I like to not just start from the ground, but think of what other people are already doing. So you can look at other organizations and see what they're doing and what can transfer to yours. And then also look at local resources. So think about training and funding, maybe political or international organization opportunities, and even private sector opportunities. They usually have a lot of funding for things like gender initiatives. Gender is a very big focus for many international bodies. So I guarantee if you look for these resources, they will be there as far as trainings and other opportunities. And we talk about starting locally. I mean, starting right from your own organization is the best place. Often, as I mentioned, what we think are our needs are not our needs. So let's ask the men and women we work with what they need to be accommodated within the organization. As we said, there's the inequalities in the roles between men and women, and right now it's predominantly women that are the caregivers. So they need those flexibilities in the workplace. And I think it is important because many organizations are losing quality staff because they are not competing with other organizations who are being more. So while I want to obviously emphasize a lot of the social benefits, I really also want you to take away a lot of the economic benefits for your organization through gender equality. So things like flexible schedules, and also personal leave days have become more common. We're seeing a little more in Canada, but these are they're very doable. They're things that they can implement easily in organizations. And it goes a long way to recognize that men and women are not equal with our roles and responsibilities, particularly the roles we have outside the workplace. So we also want to look at targeting women and men. As we mentioned, gender equality is about looking at equal opportunities for men and women. So we want to talk to men and women to find out what their needs are, as mentioned. But I think it's also very important that even though a lot of the responsibility falls on the women to have to leave early to take care of the children, this is changing. So we can't lose sight that men and women need these flexible schedules. So it's also important, if you are doing these great programs, that's great, but you need to get the word out there. So you need to advertise that you have specific programs geared at hiring women and other marginalized groups, such as potentially people with disabilities. And this will also help attract more international business and international donors. So it's also important to also look at specific percentages. So this is something that I've seen be very effective in Canada and also in some of the programs I've worked on in the past. A lot of organizations are competing for funding these days, and being an organization that is very gender forward and looking at including marginalized groups goes a long way with international donors. So looking particularly at women in management programs, this has become very popular within organizations and is something very easy for you to start up. I think the earlier stages, the better. I have seen this even at the scholarship stage within university, which already engages with females, particularly in male-dominated sectors. Some of these are even attached to things like summer internships or an internship after graduation. And so when both men and women, you should have plans with them right when they start out. So statistically, people are more likely to stay with an organization, company, whichever, when they have goals and objectives for moving forward in the future. So having something like a human resources department or a point of contact is very important. And making this plan will make people more passionate and what we call incentivize their work that they're doing. It makes them feel valued, more motivated, and they're more likely to stay longer with the organization. So this is very important for the long term. So the next point was what we had touched on earlier, providing flexibility. This is very essential to an organization. So women and men, as mentioned, they need flexibility in their roles in the workplace, and they're more likely to stay with an organization that offers this. I'm not sure in the Mongolian landscape, but in Canada, the younger generations are actually actively looking for this when applying for jobs. So some of the top graduates within the university programs will actually, since they have options, look for places that provide flexibility, longer vacations, and socially responsible programs. So there are some great, easy ways to do this, such as things we talked about earlier, schedule changes, fixed shifts. So in some organizations I've worked with, they've had different start times to accommodate some people traveling from far away, but also to accommodate women who have to pick their kids. And there's also things like time off for personal matters, but we call that personal leave, which usually gives you, it's usually about 5 days, but you don't have to specify the reason. And the last point, as we had mentioned, providing childcare centers at work, and things like kindergarten. We had talked about that example as well. Yeah, this makes it more flexible and limits your travel time, and also allows you to concentrate more on the office environment and workplace. There's a lot of research done on this, that you're actually more productive in those times, and you're more willing to not only stay longer with a company, but be very productive within those hours because you are grateful to have that flexibility. So here is a picture kind of illustrating a bit of what flexibility can look like. So if we say that men and women are equal, and they need the equal flexibility within their role, I think we get more like this, but that's not good for her. Yeah, so we just need to provide these extra opportunities so that we all can see over the fence. Of course, this one is should be pretty standard, but respecting employees is obviously very important. So there's ways that organizations can show that they respect and value their employees, so that they're feeling good about working there. So it's like individualized work sites, relationships with peers and superiors, and providing training. Yeah, so relationships with peers and superiors can involve a lot of the management. Particularly, a lot of organizations tend to be very hierarchical in nature, but management going to events and really finding out the needs of their employees is very important. And for the training, most training in organizations tends to be of a professional development nature, which is very important, but it's also important to do trainings like this: gender awareness, HR policies, focusing on things like sexual harassment. So this goes into our next point regarding anti-harassment policies. Organizations, they need to be comprehensive with their discrimination and harassment policies. First of all, it's important to note that legally you have an obligation to both have a anti-harassment policy and to train your employees on it. So it's obviously very important to know mechanisms to deal with harassment issues in a streamlined fashion. This is important so that marginalized populations feel welcomed and included within the organization. At the moment, that tends to focus a lot on women and their equality in the work. It is important to know about harassment. It can exist towards men and towards women, but the majority of complaints or issues that arise, if they are reported, tend to be against women. And it's important to note that many women feel disempowered to report when they feel sexually harassed or even cases of sexual assault. This is important to know because it exists in most workplaces, and often we are unaware of what constitutes harassment. And another thing it is important to note is not just a gender issue. It has a lot to deal, almost exclusively to deal with power relations and also socioeconomic status. Yes, so often people in lower roles are more likely to suffer harassment from people in higher roles and higher power relations. And just one more point I want to get through. I want to make it clear that harassment can be in all types of forms. Whether it's someone expecting you to perform certain duties because you are female or because you are male, or whether it is blatant harassment through comments that are sexually explicit in nature. Yes, as we mentioned, according to Mongolian law, it's required that all organizations outline sexual harassment policies and methods to deal with it. Yes, I wanted to be very detailed on the subject because it is something that affects all workplaces and is likely something that has affected many of you at some point or another. I think these issues that are coming up is the reason that having something like an anonymous phone system would be very good, but also having an outlined anti-harassment policy and the structure of how to deal with it. Harassment is basically boils down to any time you feel disempowered. Anything, any situation, anyone that makes you feel disempowered, this is harassment in all forms. I also want to say that, harassment takes all different forms. Sexual harassment is talked about a lot because it is one of the most common. But it often... there's often many things that are harassment and discrimination that we ignore completely on our daily lives. And this takes all forms, from something like having to not make an issue out of someone looking at you because they're dressed a certain way or talking to you in a certain way. I'm trying to think of also non-sexual examples, even just teasing, like the example of going to the bathroom a lot, or that women should be in the kitchen maybe when you're doing field work, things like that. These comments are not appropriate in the workplace. I also want to mention a couple things. First of all, it's very common with any harassment that your harasser will want to make you feel disempowered and not make you want to complain. So they will make it seem like a lot of times, not always, but most times, that this is in your head and you are being too sensitive, or it is not as serious as you think. And the second thing I want to say is that while most cases, I want to emphasize that most cases are of harassment, the woman is the victim, there are also situations where it is the other way as well. Men can also be harassed. And a very simple example of this is in the way, if you're at field work and you expect the women to do cooking and cleaning, maybe you also expect the men to lift everything and bring, I think this happens quite often. Yeah. Often a lot of sexual harassment issues, particularly at work functions, maybe outside of the office, Alcohol can be used as a blame. Oh, I was just drunk and this and that, but it's never excusable. It doesn't matter. We talk about how these things are evolving, and these discussions are very, very important. In Canada, we have come quite far with anti-harassment, sexual harassment, these kind of policies, but it's not been very long. I remember doing reading, and I was shocked to learn that it was, I believe, 1987 was the first Supreme Court ruling on sexual harassment. And it was brought in a restaurant by a very disempowered female who was making low wages, who was explicitly sexually harassed by the owner of the restaurant. The case settled for a very low amount, but it forced all organizations and companies to have sexual anti-harassment policies and to train their employees. My point is, this is only 30 years. It is also important to know that you have laws that are on your side. So from that perspective too, it is in an organization's best interest to have not only a policy but a training on it, so all employees can say that they are aware. In looking at another way that organizations can value their employees, paying equal wages is very important. So this can allow for empowerment. It also allows for men and women to feel valued equally, very important. And it'll also make them want to stay longer. A lot of organizations can get away also with pay inequalities because pay is confidential, so you often do not know what your counterparts are making. But yes, it is a form of discrimination based entirely on preconceived gender normative behavior. So while on the surface things might seem equal, it is important to understand these situations and how they affect pay equality. I also want to say this is an interesting example because in Canada, when you go on leave for maternity, it is against the law to not come back to the same level. While these social norms and learned behaviors exist, it does not mean they're right, nor does it mean that because men have pressure to be the breadwinner, that they should be paid more than women. Especially as roles are changing, it is more the equal responsibility of men and women to provide for the family. This refers to financially and to caretaking responsibilities. But these are very important discussion points because they are very common topics and very common things that come up in the workplace. This one is about how to integrate gender policies into the workplace. Creating gender policies, such as a gender mainstreaming strategy, is a very common way to do this. Many international organizations have done this. Some private industries have started to do this as well. And I think it's important to note, if done correctly, they can be very effective. Also, as mentioned, doing a gender analysis of your organization is very important. This gives a baseline assessment, and it also allows you to see the gaps. And I think one of the most important aspects for integration is human resources. HR is the front line of your organization, so they do the hiring practices, salary allocations, and also do many of the trainings. They're often also the contact point for any harassment complaints. So even in smaller organizations, I think it is very important to have at least one person who is the HR designated person. And with this role, it also can evolve into coordinating, training, capacity building. So further into this point, once you have policies, it is very, very important to do gender trainings around the policies you've created. And I must say that this is a very great group, and you have a pretty high, even with not a lot of gender training, you have a very high understanding of gender roles, but not every workplace does. So I think once you understand how these roles influence the workplace, it is important to create an open space of dialogue. In my opinion, this is one of the most essential things, because our resistance to talk about gender issues or to feel comfortable to ask questions doesn't help us grow. So even if we have maybe some outdated assumptions or gender bias or stereotypes, it is important to address them and for someone to talk about them in order to see why they may not be correct and how we can move forward. So another quite essential part to an organization for gender integration is having a gender focal point. This can be the person that can arrange training and gender awareness, but also the person you can ask questions to as well. And as we mentioned earlier, the idea is that it doesn't just become this one person as the champion. In fact, everyone becomes the champion for their organization. This moves to the next point, for training and capacity, which is a very, very important point for gender awareness. And this is where a focal point can be very helpful, because they understand the organization and probably understand some gaps or issues that are occurring there. So questions to ask yourself within your organization: is there awareness and competence among management, technical, and field staff on gender within the organization? And I think it is important that at all levels of the organization they're participating in training such as this. It's important to know we all have to start somewhere, and just having the discussion is a great first step. Which kind of goes to the next point of your organization supporting opportunities for training and follow up on gender by the staff, which would be like today, I think. By allowing staff to attend training such as this, it obviously shows that your organization is moving forward on gender issues, and it is a priority. And it is important to know we are all constantly learning and coming up with new ideas and concepts. So it is a long-term process. So I think to the last point on this, this is like bringing up the initial steps, moving towards awareness for gender mainstreaming policies within your organization. So it's also important to look at things like public relations. You can be the best at gender awareness, gender mainstreaming, all these things, but if people don't know that's what you're doing, you're not going to attract people to your organization. So how you brand yourself is important in all facets of your organization. What is the image of the organization among stakeholders regarding gender issues? Are you seen as gender forward, or are you seen not so much focusing on gender? In organizations I've seen that are very gender forward, this filters right from management down to the administrative assistants, all levels within the organization. I think it's also important to look at the materials and publications. These are the advertisements for your organization. Are they portraying men and women based on stereotypes? Or are you showing women and men in non-traditional roles and kind of breaking those? Images are very important within an organization. It helps encourage or show people whether they will feel welcome and included within your organization. So do advocacy and publicity materials used by the organization include information from a gender perspective? This is important to ask yourself. Before I get into the next section, I just wanted to say too, an example from the Merit Project, which I thought was quite unique, is they actually have each employee do a gender module when they join. And I think this is an example of things that many organizations can do. Even things you hear about in the media can be very beneficial and bring up a lot of gender issues often. The next topic, which I think will be very useful for your organization, especially with our long-term gender plans, is looking at gender mainstreaming policies. I think this can be a very overwhelming topic, especially since most of you, I think almost all of you, just learned about gender mainstreaming today. It's hard to envision having a policy and trying to figure out where to start. And I think while this can be a very beneficial approach, I think also there are many organizations that haven't done it well, and obviously that's not what we want here. So in order to create a beneficial gender mainstreaming policy, one that people are reading, one that is applied in your organization and doesn't just sit on a shelf, I think these are some guidelines of what you should do. So this is happening after you've done your analysis and you've reassessed your outcomes and objectives that you want to see for gender in your organization. And so I think you also need to, when you are creating this policy, to give the background. You want the why section. The why does gender matter to your organization? And I think to do this really well, you want to make it as specific to your sector and to your organization as possible. For most organizations, gender is either misunderstood or it's not really taught or discussed. So it's very important that employees understand why this policy is created. And this will help give you a lot more buy-in within the organization and for the policy itself. So next, ideally by this point, you will have a committee which would be organized with a group at all different levels of the organization and in different sectors of the organization. And this is where you would outline your goals, objectives, and guiding principles, which would be decided upon with management. And so these would be the objectives and principles that would have been decided upon from your gender analysis. So to do this policy well, I think it's very, very important that your gender analysis feeds into the objectives and principles that you've decided upon. And this is also where your gender focal point comes in a very high esteem, because they will take the trainings that they've had and awareness and be able to illustrate these points to not only staff but predominantly to management at this stage. So this is important to just make sure that you don't produce something I would call more of a generic policy. You want it to be very specific, and I use this point a lot because it's very common that management asks two questions. One, why do we need this policy? And two, why don't we just make something that they see other organizations do? Obviously, the needs, so if people are basing them off of maybe a UN policy or something, which is good as a beginning piece, but the needs for something like UNDP would be much different than the needs of your organization. So once you have outlined all of your goals, objectives, guiding principles, you get to what I like to call the guts of your policy, which is an important part, the implementation. And this is really important because you can talk about all the reasons why you need gender and what your objectives are with it, but until you show how you will implement it properly in your organization, it probably won't go much further. So as mentioned, this is very common with many organizations. So to make this unique, I think what you need to include as some of the topics we have talked about earlier would be first having that gender analysis piece, then assessing the expectations and looking at the expected results of management, but also of the organization as a whole. And then you have the capacity and leadership development piece, which, as mentioned, would be great through an HR department, but I think that's part of the long-term goal. In the short term, this would mainly be done through a gender focal point. So I think this last piece relates a lot back to the public relations part we talked about. You can have the best gender mainstreaming policy written and be very gender aware as an organization, but if you are not training people on it and they do not know what's available and what you are doing, then so what? So a really effective way that I've done a lot of trainings on that I think is very good is through gender mainstreaming checklists. So there are many examples of checklists, but I think as I'm always going to emphasize, the most important aspect is making it as contextually specific to your organization as possible. And where a lot of organizations tend to fail in making gender forward programming is that they are not starting right from the beginning. So gender mainstreaming has to start at every single level of your project planning and implementation. So aside from just the programming angle, I think it's very important that gender mainstreaming is embedded in every aspect of your organization as a whole as well. And this can look at the way that you collect your data, but also in ways that you are targeting funding and projects that focus on gender. And it's important to know that gender is cross-cutting, so it's across all sectors. So there's always an opportunity for it to be integrated. And as mentioned, it's important that the checklists are very relevant to the context, but I think that has multiple contexts, such as regional, national, social. Meaning the way you implement programming at a national level will likely be a lot different than with regional partners. So this is just an example here. This will just go through as a basic example. I think the point with gender mainstreaming checklists, the ones that I've seen that are done best, are actually simplified. They're just meant as a reminder at each stage of the project to make sure that you have thought of gender. And I think one of the most important parts, aside from the implementation, is how you are monitoring and evaluating it. So gender should be included in your results-based management as well. And also, I think, what was I going to say? One of the most important parts with a gender mainstreaming checklist is to often a lot of organizations just need slight modifications for what they're doing. So you're probably already doing things very, very well, but maybe because lack of gender awareness, there's just little modifications you can make in existing programming. When I was working previously in Vietnam, I worked with a public health university, so they primarily focused on research. And a lot of the work I did was just very slight modifications on how they collect data on men and women. And then also looking at roles and responsibilities when collecting data, and access. In this case, it was access to public health. As mentioned, this is important in all different departments in your organization, but I would say a strong emphasis on those working on socioeconomic. I think this is part of more of a long-term strategy, but it's good to have some awareness and understanding of how to do this properly. One of the most important aspects for gender mainstreaming policies is the monitoring and evaluation side. So this is the kind of end piece to see how or what is being done for gender awareness activities and how it can be improved upon. Particularly in the beginning, this is a very important aspect because you want to learn from what's working and what's not. And the strategies that I've seen that have been most effective are the ones that learn from their mistakes and make those changes. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations tend to do programming or themselves be gender blind, which means they're not focusing on gender awareness at all. And I think this is a really important piece, the monitoring and evaluation, to show whether you are focusing enough on gender priorities. And I just wanted to use an example for the learning, the monitoring and evaluation, to learn from what's going right and what's not. There's an organization in Canada called Engineers Without Borders. They work all around the world. And they came out with something called the Failure Report. And it was quite new and in some cases controversial, as many people had not seen this with NGOs. And it brought up essentially all the failures, but it brought up a discussion on what they could do and how they could learn from them. And so it allowed them to adapt a lot of their policies and programs And interesting enough, a lot of them were gender blind, so they made them more gender aware. And so they actually did a TED Talk on this, and it was very good. So now it is something they do every year, annually. And the fact that they are open and engaged in learning from their mistakes makes for a very open corporate culture. But my point is that is how we learn, and that is something that's very transferable within your own organization. So it is important that we do a gender mainstreaming focus at every annual planning meeting.